What is going on, everybody? Is the Icebreaker here, back with another video. Apologies for the delay for this one. Kind of was a little bit under the weather the past week, so I didn't really record a video. And I initially was planning on releasing this video like during the weekend, but the audio kind of got screwed up, so I had to do it second take. So here it is. Hopefully, I get this one out before the start of the season, obviously, because these are my Atlantic Division standings predictions for the upcoming NHL 2024-2025 season. So obviously, my last video of this mini four-part series here, going to be predicting every single team in the Atlantic, kind of where I see them falling in this division, starting from 8th to up to the top with first in the division. For me, the Atlantic Division is probably the toughest one to predict because, in my opinion, it is the strongest division in the entire league. I may or may not have some hot takes for this one. This might be a division that a lot of people are going to have different opinions on. Probably a lot of people are going to disagree with my rankings here. But anyway, we'll get right into the video, starting with last in the Atlantic. I mean, a dead last, 8th in the Atlantic. Not really a huge shocker to anybody. I got the Montreal Canadiens once again. 35, 34, and 13 for 83 points. I do have them gradually improving a little bit from last season, getting 76 points. So I think they're going to take another step forward. It's still a young team. I think they are gradually going to get better, but in this division, it's really tough to predict them any higher than the other teams that I have ahead of them. Obviously, I was very tempted to put them in 7th, maybe even 6th in this division, but ultimately I couldn't get myself to do it. So I have them in last right now with 83 points. Now, if any of you guys have been following the Montreal Canadiens, I'm pretty sure that their goal is not to make the playoffs, but a lot of the guys, in that organization have been saying that the Habs need to be in the mix this season for a playoff spot. So, meaning playing in meaningful games late in the season down the stretch in like late March, early April, things of that nature, right? We know that this team has a very promising future, but like I said before, I still feel like they're a step behind the rest of the division. I think they did make some pretty amazing moves in the offseason to kind of put themselves in the discussion with the rest of those teams in the Atlantic. The big acquisition, obviously, Patrick Laine, but since their last preseason game, which happened Saturday, I was gonna post the video before that preseason game, but obviously a lot has changed for many teams this division over the last few days. And obviously, Patrick Laine went down with appears to be a very serious knee injury. With all the promise of him being a part of that top six, it looks like he's going to be out long term. The reports are suggesting that at minimum he's going to be out probably 4 months, which is the majority of the season. So it's very disappointing. Obviously, being a Habs fan, I'm obviously very yeah, I'm devastated by that news because obviously I was hoping for him to really show what he can do still in his career and kind of rejuvenate himself from the kind of tough seasons he had in Columbus. But obviously that dream shattered for now, and the team's going to have to go on without him most likely. And his presence was a big reason why I thought maybe the Habs could take an even further step in the standings. I think I initially had them in like the 7 range, like 85-ish points, but I had to dock them down a little bit. Obviously, Line is a fantastic player. I had to, doctor points a little bit, but even so, I still think they're going to make some improvements. The team still has really solid young pieces, a very promising future. Nick Suzuki, Cole Caulfield, Uri Slavkovsky to complete that top line. Second half of the season, they were one of the better top lines in the NHL, statistically speaking, at least. But also Kirby Dach coming back and, filling that void at the number 2 center spot. He looked like he was looked very promising the year before. He looked like he was breaking out, but even then he missed a little bit of time. And then last season, obviously, the second game of the year, tore his MCL and ACL, which is ironically an injury that Patrick Laine may or may not have. So, 2 years in a row, we're getting like a top 6 forward, losing essentially the entire season of development. But Kirby Dach coming back, I think, is going to be a very impactful player. As our number 2 center, I think he's going to return to what he was and, flirt with 50 to 60 points. I have him kind of with 60. But anyway, a lot of promising guys up front for sure. But still, again, in this division, kind of hard to predict them being any higher. Really, apart from that top 6, which obviously Laine is not going to be a part of, presumably. Alex Newhook, I think, is solid. But the rest of the team could use some work, although I think the bottom 6 probably looks better than it has in years past because guys like Christian Dvorak in his early stages with Montreal and even Josh Anderson throughout, the first 4 years he's been with the Habs, he's been forced to play in a top 6 role, even though it seems like he's best suited in a third line role. So Now with Patrick Laine gone, he might have to play top 6 minutes again, which really hurts. But him in the third line role would have been a lot better. I like Joshua Roy a lot. I think he has potential to be really solid top 9 guy, and I think he fits perfectly in the lineup. Kind of Evans, Gallagher, I think is actually one of the better fourth lines in the league. Evans' defensive presence as well, being one of the most underrated like defensive centers in the league. Joel Armia had a career high 17 goals last year. If he can contribute a little bit close to that, I think that's obviously helps their fourth line. And Gallagher with fully healthy season last year had a very solid 16 goals and 31 points. For this stage of his career, probably not going to get you the 30 goals that he once did. I still think the forward group overall, I don't think it's the worst in the league. I actually think it's decent, and I think their offense is going to improve a little bit this year. On defense, I think they could use a little bit of work. Apart from a couple veterans in Matheson, who obviously had a great offensive year last year at 62 points, but I don't see him replicating that, and he kind of struggles in his own end at times a lot as well. So, and then there's David Savard, who's much older, but solid stay-at-home guy. He's had some good years here and some not so great years here. Lane Hutson's the key because he has the potential to be a superstar offensive defenseman if he can really realize it. But, his size is a bit of a concern. But if he is ready to take the reins and, maybe quarterbacks the top power play, he could be in for a really underrated rookie season and could be in the conversation for the Calder Trophy. And Caden Gooley, another guy to complete that top 4. I think he's really solid and is going to be a top pair defenseman for years to come. And the third pair of Xhekaj and Barron is fine. I don't really care for Barron's game personally. I would have a guy like probably Jaden Struble, maybe even Logan Mailloux over him in the lineup, but that's just my opinion. But the defense, it's a work in progress. A lot of young guys. It's still going to need to improve quite a bit to get this team back into playoff contention, I guess. And there's their goaltending of Montembeault and Primo. All things considered, actually was pretty solid last year. The goaltending that is. Montembeault, in my opinion, does have the potential to at the very least be a really solid 1A starter. Maybe he's not like a superstar goalie ever, but I think he is a serviceable starter, at least right now. And Primo had a really good season, especially after Jake Allen was traded with that 3-goalie rotation was finally out the window. He definitely played his game and played some of the best hockey of his career, quite frankly, because at the NHL level, he had yet to really prove that he could do anything at the NHL level, be even a consistent guy. He was always struggling in the few games he got in the years prior to this past season. So the goaltending, I think, is underrated. It's not the best in the league, but it's far from the worst. I think a lot of people don't realize that this goaltending is actually a lot better than people think. So overall, I see an improving roster, but like I said, in this Atlantic Division, hard to predict this team making the playoffs, let alone surpassing any other team in this division at the moment. So I got this team in 8th in the division, only 83 points, getting better, but still not quite good enough. Maybe in another year or two, they can put themselves in that playoff conversation. But as of right now, not quite ready. Getting into 7th in the division, this is a team that I think is actually going to regress a little bit. I don't actually think they're that much better than the Habs because I think the Habs have definitely narrowed the gap with this division, even though I still think they're last. But coming in 7th here, a bit of a hot take. I have the Detroit Red Wings regressing to 38, 35, and 9 for 85 points. I know they finished with 91 last year, but there's still some glaring holes in this roster, and there's many reasons to believe that they overachieved in certain aspects. I thought their power play probably going to be unsustainable. It was top 10 last year, but losing key guys like Shane Gostisbehere and David Perron, I definitely think is going to hurt their power play. And there was many times over the course of the season where they relied heavily on that power play, and at even strength, they kind of struggled a bit more to provide the offense. And also, I'm not sold on this team overall. I just think they overachieved. I don't like their defense. I think their goaltending is questionable. We'll dissect their roster a bit, but right now, I think the Red Wings are a popular pick by many to take that next step into the playoffs. I'm kind of on the other side of that. I actually think they're going to regress this year. Now, with 85 points, that's not to say that I don't think they're going to be in the mix. I think I have them missing the playoffs by 6 or 7 points. So they're still kind of in the playoff hunt, and they're not going to be significantly worse. I don't think they're going to be a bottom 5 team, but I still think they are going to regress to the point where they're not really in the playoff, in the hunt, but just not one of those teams that are fighting it for the very last few games of the season, if you know what I'm saying. So yeah, But still, like I said, I don't like their defense apart from Moritz Seider and a potential breakout from Simon Edvinsson. But even him, we don't know if he's going to take that next step. And if he doesn't cement himself as a true top pair defenseman, especially on this Red Wings blue line, just the defense looks so discombobulated. I'm just not a fan of what they have overall. And again, with the goaltending, you bring in an older Cam Talbot who had a solid season last year with the Kings, although fizzled out late. He's shown that he could play well on great defensive teams, or at least solid defensive teams like the Kings had last year. But you look at the year before, he was awful on the Senators, who were not a very good defensive team. And now he's going this year with the Red Wings team that projects to be a subpar defensive team as well. So I just wonder how the goaltending is going to hold up with that, well, for lack of a better term, weak defense in front of it. But obviously, the strength of this team is their forward group and their offense. I mean, I could see it regressing a little bit. I think their shooting percentage was also unsustainably high, but I still really like what they have going for their top six, which is why I think they're obviously going to be competitive. But I don't know. I just see other young teams in this Atlantic division that I'm a little bit higher on, which could be seen as a hot take considering that the Red Wings have proven more compared to those other teams that obviously I'll get to later because I have them ranked higher. But yeah, I guess I'm just not sold on them right now. Obviously, their top six, very solid. You got Dylan Larkin, you got Alex DeBrincat, you got Lucas Raymond to complete that top line. I think it's a fantastic top line. I do question Dylan Larkin's health at times because over the last few years, he has tended to miss quite a few games. And I think him going down late last season, I think was ultimately kind of what cost this team the playoffs, because if you don't watch the Red Wings, Dylan Larkin really is the heartbeat of that team. He is the driving force, and without him, his presence was sorely missed. Everybody saw it. Then you got Alex DeBrincat. I think he needs to get back to that 35 to 40 goal form, which I think he can get back to, but the past couple years, 27 goals apiece, I believe. For him, he's a natural goal scorer. To me, 27 goals just straight up isn't good enough. And even considering how hot of a start he got off to last year and completely kind of fizzled out to just barely missed 30 goals. I just think he's capable of way more offense, especially on this team with the guys he has around him to score more than 27 goals. But Lucas Raymond's a guy I'm eyeing as well because he had a breakout season of 31 goals and 72 points last year, and I think he could take another step forward. Fantastic contract that the Red Wings got him to lock down for 8 years for. I could see him being a north of a point per game player this season. I think there's maybe an outside shot he can actually lead the team in scoring, especially if Dylan Larkin isn't fully healthy and Raymond can maybe push for 90 points. I don't think that's a huge hot take because I think he has that ceiling. He's a former, number 4 overall draft pick. I think he has the potential to be a 90-plus point player in the prime of his career, and I'm pretty sure he's going to be entering those prime stages of his career, in the coming year or two. As for the second line, Patrick Kane had a bit of a resurgence last year, near point per game last season in the games he did play, and I think fully healthy, we should expect to see around 70 points from him on that second line. I think he still obviously can prove that he can play in this league and be an impactful player at that. As for JT Compher and Vladimir Tarasenko, I think that's fine for their second line, but Vladimir Tarasenko clearly isn't the all-star player he was with the Blues, and I think at best we should probably expect 60 points. If that, maybe he'll be 50 to 55, kind of like what he was last year. And then there's JT Compher, who I think for now fits fine as that second line center. But for me personally, I view him more as a third line center guy, even though, he's capable of putting up between 40 and 50 points, which I don't know, it's maybe more of a fringe second line center, but a great third line center, I guess. As for their bottom six, it's nothing to sneeze at, but nothing to write home about either. I mean, Joe Veleno hasn't really shown much potential other than being a bottom six forward. Same could be said for Michael Rasmussen. Andrew Kopp has been fairly disappointing considering the contract that he got, but I think he is pretty much a third line guy. And if he can get you around 30 points, I think that he just is what he is at this point. And Jonathan Berggren's another guy that maybe Red Wings fans are expecting to take another step forward. We'll see what happens if he can provide some solid bottom six scoring there. Like I said, with the defense, unless Simon Edvinsson takes a step forward and really breaks out, I don't like Ben Sherrod on the top pair with Moritz Seider. I think we've seen it work. I've seen it not work, actually. And Jeff Petrie, clearly not what he was with Montreal. And even his last year there, he was clearly on the decline. And with Pittsburgh, that decline continued. In this past season, I believe he only hit 19 points. And his offense has completely fallen off a cliff. And He's never been the greatest defensive guy either. So yeah, and Oli Mata, Eric Gustafson, it's a hit or miss third pair as well, especially with Eric Gustafson. I know that they have him quarterbacking the top unit, and he does have that potential some years to be like a steal in terms of offense and get like 40 plus points. But then there's other years where he's just a non-factor on both ends of the ice. So yeah, I'm not a fan of this defense. The goaltending is also questionable too. Cam Talbot, Alex Lyon. Alex Lyon's somewhat unproven. I mean, he's done fine as a backup, but if he's a starter on this team, can he handle that load? And even last year, it wasn't a particularly amazing season for him, although he had a 901, so he had over 900 save percentage. You know, in today's NHL, if you get over 900, you're a decent goalie at least, because the offense has gotten so much better that goaltending as a whole has kind of declined over the last few years. But yeah, I just not sold on this goaltending tandem. I think they have huge problems between the pipes and on the blue line. That's a big reason why I think the Red Wings are going to regress. I still think this division is very tough, and maybe some people think this team's going to take a massive step forward. Like I said before, I'm on the opposite side of that. I think they're going to regress, and ultimately I have them missing the playoffs, only 7th in the Atlantic. Next, we got 6th in the Atlantic Division, another hot take. I got the Tampa Bay Lightning also regressing, and I ultimately have them missing the playoffs. Obviously, if you're bottom 3 in your division, you automatically miss the playoffs. I got them 42, 33, and 7 for 91 points. I have them just barely missing the playoffs because I do have those other 5 teams making the playoffs coming out of the Atlantic Division. And the Tampa Bay Lightning, hot take, will not be one of them. To me, this is another team with massive holes throughout their lineup. I actually don't really care for this team at all. I didn't think their offseason was all that great. I like that they added Jake Gensel, obviously. That's a fantastic forward, and he's going to be great on that top line. But apart from that, wasn't a huge fan of the Mikhail Sergachev trade. I know J.J. Moser, you know, he's decent. Connor Geekie as a prospect, and he was one of their top prospects for the Coyotes. So I guess that's fine. But Ryan McDonough, bringing him back, he's on the back nine of his career, probably looking to decline as well, being like 36, 37 years old. I just don't really like how their defense shaped up. And Victor Hedman, who they just named captain, has been declining defensively the last couple of seasons, even though he can be a great offensive point producer from the back end. But he's clearly not the two-way beast he once was on that blue line as a number 1 defenseman for the Lightning. And outside of that top line of Jake Gensel, Braden Point, and Nikita Kucherov, which we all know is probably going to be one of, if not the best top line in the NHL, this team has major, and I mean major, depth issues. Like these next 3 lines here, I'm not a huge fan of it. Like, I don't know where the secondary scoring is going to come from. Like, Brandon Hagel, to me, had a career year last year. He could still be a guy who can get you 20 plus goals and maybe 50, 55 points, but I don't think he's going to produce at the same rate he did last season, and especially on a second line with Anthony Cirelli and Connor Sheary, who in my opinion are probably both third line players. Especially Connor Sheary, but even Anthony Cirelli, I mean, he's a fantastic like two-way centerman, is great defensively, but he has not shown he can take any step forward offensively. I've been trying to predict the last few years that he would be a guy that could, you know, take a step forward offensively. He has really yet to do so. Maybe he can do it this season in a bigger role because he's going to, obviously a lot more is going to be asked of a guy like him, but as a number 2 center, he just doesn't give me enough offense to really classify him as such. Kind of reminds me more of a Philip Deneau, where he's a fantastic shutdown guy, but his offense isn't like his biggest strength. And I think Cirelli is more so of a third line center. And honestly, unless he gets 50 to 60 points, which I don't envision happening at this point, he's honestly not really a true top 6 forward in my opinion. And the rest of this depth, I just nothing to write home about. Their fourth line is just not going to give really any offense. Glendenning, Jurgensen, Ylonen. No, I don't see it. Cam Atkinson's more of like a reclamation project, and you know he hasn't been himself the last few years. He's been hurt a bit, but maybe in a third line role, he can have a bounce back year, get to like at least 15 goals, 30 points, something like that. That would be nice. But overall, I'm just not a huge fan of this forward group. On defense, it's not the worst in the world, but again, certain guys have taken steps back defensively, and I don't think that's gonna bode well for their goaltending. With Andrei Vasilevsky, who the last couple of seasons really hasn't been himself. You can blame the injuries being a part of that, but you know, for the last 5 years, he was widely regarded as the best goaltender in the NHL, without debate. And now it kind of is a debate. He hasn't really played like a top 10 goalie in the NHL, to be honest, the last few years. And if his play only continues to decline, that means bad things for the Lightning because honestly, you could argue that, despite Nikita Kucherov being the superstar that he is, Andre Vasilevsky is the Tampa Bay Lightning. He is the backbone of that team. And if he's not playing 100% and he's not playing like himself, the Lightning obviously have no chance to do anything. I mean, you saw the past couple of years, he wasn't very good, especially in the playoffs. Big reason why this team was an early playoff exit, losing in the first round. And this season, I could legitimately see a reason for them to not even make the playoffs altogether, considering how much better the Atlantic Division is getting. And just looking at this Lightning roster, I think there's enough holes to make the case that this team isn't quite what they once were. I definitely think their window has closed. And as soon as this season, they could be on the outside looking in come playoff time. Yes, getting into my playoff teams in the Atlantic Division in fifth in the second wild card. I know a lot of people are probably going to laugh at me at this, but I do have the Buffalo Sabres making the playoffs. I think their lineup is good enough this season, and I think they're poised to take that next step forward. I think last year was just a bit of a regression year, and they'll bounce back and get back into the low 90s, and this time it will be enough to make the playoffs. I got them 42, 32, and 8 for 92 points, sneaking in that second wild card in the Eastern Conference. I mean, the last few years, the Sabres have shown that they do have a bright future. They have one of the best prospect pools in the entire NHL, a ton of young talent coming up soon. I just really love where the team is heading. I love their core. And you know what? I'm all for hot takes, but I genuinely believe that the Sabres do have the capabilities of finally taking that step forward and finally making the playoffs for the first time since, 2011. The last time this team was really relevant was when Lindy Ruff was behind the bench, and they just hired him to coach the Sabres once again. And I still think he has something left to give as an NHL coach. I mean, look what he did the past couple of last year, 2 years ago with the New Jersey Devils, right? They were one of the best teams in the NHL, and he was the bench boss there. And he got fired unfairly, in my opinion, last season, just due to poor goaltending and a lack of health. But that team was definitely good enough to make the playoffs for second year in a row. Things just got out of their control, basically. And I think him behind the bench with the Sabres team, I think he's going to bring that veteran experience, obviously behind the bench, coaching a young team. I think it's going to do nothing but good for this team. Again, I think it's a very talented, more complete lineup than it has been in years past. Starting with their forward group, I think right out the gate, they have a really solid top six with a lot of potential to be one of the better offensive teams. Tage Thompson being the number one center kind of had a disappointing year last year, only scoring 29 goals, 56 points compared to the year before where he had 47 goals and 94 points. I'm fully expecting him to bounce back. I think at worst he gets like 70, 75 points, but I think more realistically he will get back to being a point per game player at the very least, and leading that Sabres team in scoring, in my opinion. I think JJ Peterka had a pretty solid breakout season in his second year last year, flirted with 30 goals, and I can see him maybe surpassing that this season as well. Alex Tuch is a very solid forward there on that top line, has really broken out since being acquired by the Sabres, his hometown team as well. I think he could maybe flirt with 70 points, have a bounce back season. There's a lot of guys on the Sabres last year that kind of had disappointing seasons. Dylan Cousins is another one. He went from like 70 points to not even breaking 50 last year. I think he'll bounce back as the number two center, hover between 60 and 70 points is my guess. But also the return of Jack Quinn, who missed the majority of the season last year, and he still has potential to be a really good top six forward, and I think he could be due for a breakout season as well. And Zach Benson in his second year to complete that top six. He's looking like a steal already, and I think he has all the skill set in the world to be one of the more prolific offensive players. Certainly on this team, but even in the league in the years to come. So I really like their top six. I think there's a ton of potential for it to improve. And as for the bottom six, Zucker, McLeod, Greenway, I actually think it's a really solid fourth line. You could, laugh at the trade for getting rid of Matt Savoy, who was one of their top prospects, for a guy like Ryan McLeod, who probably his ceiling is a third line center, but I think just in terms of the depth, it's just a more complete bottom six. They're more gritty guys who kind of know their roles, but even guys like McLeod and Zucker, for example, can get you some solid offense, hover around 15 to 20 goals on a good year. And even their fourth line, I think, is a solid fourth line. And I just think it's a more well-balanced forward group than they've had in years past. And that's why I think the Sabres are definitely looking a lot stronger than they have been, legitimately. On the defensive end, you got Rasmus Dahlin, who top 10 defenseman in the NHL easily. You can argue he's top 5, especially if he has like a point per game season, and gets back to the 70 to 80 point range where he had the year before. Bowen Byram, since coming over from Colorado, actually looked really solid, and I think he is a welcome addition for that top four. And the Sabres, defensively, I think they look significantly better as well. And Owen Power, their former number one overall pick, looking to take another step forward. And I think he's going to cement himself as a top defenseman in the NHL in the not too distant future. Just really like their defense. I think it's improving, not the best in the league, but certainly it's getting there. And as for their goaltending, I think it's really solid as well. Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, especially down the stretch, he was playing like legitimately one of the best goalies in the NHL. And if he can carry that over into the start of this season, then the goaltending looks in much better shape. Bounce back season from Devon Levi would be prevalent as well. As him being so young too, I think he has a lot of room to grow. Overall, this team, to me, there's just a lot more. I have a lot more faith in it than a team like the Red Wings. I just think positionally, I trust every part of their team a little bit more. And I think the Sabres just have the potential to make that jump and finally bounce back. And I think this is a playoff roster, in my opinion. And I think they're going to surprise a lot of people this year. And I have them getting in. I got them 5th in the Atlantic. Coming in at 4th in the Atlantic Division, in my opinion, this is another team that I think is going to take a massive step forward. I think they're probably the most heavily slept on team entering this season. I got the Ottawa Senators 44-31-7 for 95 points. And I think they are poised to finally take that step forward. They got a really solid roster now, and I think they're capable of being one of the better teams in the Atlantic, and I got them sneaking into the playoffs as a wildcard team. To me, with the Senators, the issue has never been their goal scoring. I think offensively, they've always been a really solid team, especially the last couple of seasons. But for me, I think the big addition of Linus Ullmark, I think, is going to make a tremendous impact. I think if they even get average goaltending from him, to me, the Senators team is a playoff team because statistically, this team was good enough offensively, and what really held them back was how bad their goaltending was. And I think if the numbers are a little bit better, if they can get a 9-10 save percentage from their goaltending this year, the Senators have the capabilities of actually taking that step forward and making the playoffs. Yes, they are a playoff hopeful. I think on paper they should improve. The question is, will they? I think a lot of people have been expecting them for a couple of years now to take that step forward. But I think this season there's more merit to that than any other year prior because of how much better their goaltending is. Ullmark brings stability. He's a guy who, over the course of his career, has been consistent as ever, essentially every team he's played for, including some of those awful Sabres teams that were like flirting with the worst team in the league. There was one year they were absolutely awful, and he was really, really solid for them statistically. So I think he's going to bring that solid play. He's definitely going to help them, push them over the edge, right? And as for the forward group that they added some better depth with David Perron and Michael Amadio to complement their bottom six. I think now they have more secondary scoring, which has in some aspects been a bit of an issue over the past couple of years, although their top six has been elite. Nick Jensen, I think, is just a better fit on their defense than Jakob Chychrun was, who, yes, they might lose a bit on the offensive end from their blue line, but Nick Jensen is much more defensively sound. Jakob Chychrun had an awful defensive year last year with Ottawa, and I don't think that will be sorely missed because I think the Senators' defense with the addition of Jensen is definitely just going to be more well-rounded, more balanced, more complete, and just better two-way play, basically, from their defense group overall. And especially a bounce-back season from Tits Stützle is probably going to be needed because only having 18 goals, 70 points last year, I think he is at the very least a point per game player consistently. Can he get back to the 90-plus point guy that he was 2 years ago? That remains to be seen, but I think overall this team is definitely in prime position to finally having that breakout season. Like I mentioned, great top six: Brady Tkachuk, Tim Stützle, Claude Giroux. Josh Norris, you need him to stay healthy, but when he is healthy, we all know what he can do. He can be a consistent 25 to 30 goal scorer, but again, just needs to stay healthy. Drake Batherson is one of the more underrated players in the league, but what you get from him. He's going to hover around 60, 65 points, 25 to 30 goals, most likely. And then there's Shane Pinto, who I think is going to be poised for a massive breakout season as their number 2 center. I think he does have the capabilities of being that second line center. Played really solid in the games that he did play last year. And I think he's one of those guys that'll be in for a 50-plus point season this year as their number 2 guy. And again, for the bottom six, adding Amadio, Perron, even Nick Cousins, I think probably not going to give you a ton of offense, but just the presence there, the grittiness, the physicality. He's a welcome addition to that bottom six for sure. And I think the center is looking a lot tougher than they have as well in the last couple of years. And Ridley Gregg, I still think, has a decent ceiling. And as a third line center, I think that bodes well for Ottawa as well. Offensively, on the defensive end, I still think they need work because with the third pair of Tyler Cleveland and Jacob Bernard Docker, two guys that are just trying to benefit from the lack of defensive depth that the Senators have, but especially JBD, a guy that's kind of been knocking on the door the last couple of seasons. If he can cement himself as a full-time NHL defenseman, that will bode well for the blue line of the Senators. But with their top four, Shabbat now not having to play necessarily, like he can now focus on his game, be more offensive with Nick Jensen being that stay-at-home guy. I think that pair kind of balances out. And Shabbat doesn't have to do as much, doesn't have to carry as much of a workload, and his minutes can go down, which will benefit the defense overall, in my opinion. And then Artem Zub, I think, is solid what he does. Pretty physical guy, can block shots. He's very solid in that retrospect. And then there's Jake Sanderson, who heading into his third season, I believe, definitely poised to becoming one of the better defensemen in the NHL. He still has that ceiling to be a perennial top 10 defenseman in the league. And I think he's also in for a breakout season, especially offensively. Quarterbacking the top unit now, he could be in for a 50-plus point campaign. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if he gets more. I definitely think he has that ceiling to be a true number one defenseman in the NHL. So overall, I think just the blue line definitely internally, I think, is going to improve a bit. And like I mentioned, the goaltending is the key. Linus Ullmark, if he comes in and remains his consistent self, the Senators, in my opinion, are without a doubt a playoff team. They have all the ingredients in the world. They have the right recipe to, finally take that step forward. And Forsberg maybe bouncing back, playing less games as the backup. Solid team, in my opinion. I know a lot of people might not agree that this team is ready. I, on the other hand, think they are. And as a result, I have them fourth in the division, making the first wild card in the East and getting back into the playoffs. Now, this is kind of where the hot takes end. I think the top three teams, for the most part, are pretty consensus from people. But third, I'm going with the Boston Bruins, 45, 27, and 10 for 100 points. Although, the new news circulating, Jeremy Swayman's still unsigned. He's clearly their star goaltender. I mean, we just mentioned Linus Ullmark, who the Bruins traded away to presumably make Jeremy Swayman the full-time starter. But now he's without a contract. And, he wants to test his worth because he thinks he's worth more than what the Bruins are currently offering him. And him not being a part of this team, I will say, is a major concern because he really is obviously the best goaltender they have. And now, riding with Jonas Korpisalo as their starter, probably not the best idea. But overall, I still think the Bruins are going to get by with it, at least for now. And I think they have enough of a, structured roster defensively and, a lot of good players up and down their lineup that can contribute. Like the Bruins are always a team that kind of defy the odds, despite not being the most talented team on paper. They always seem to put it together come regular season. So that's a big reason why I'm not really going to bet against them to miss the playoffs entirely. I still have them with a 100-point campaign, maybe being a little bit worse than last year, but ultimately I still think they're good enough to be top three in this division for sure. Yes, the core is older. Yes, the offense is probably drying up. But outside of David Pastrnak and Brad Marchand, and maybe a bounce back season from Elias Lindholm, who's going to be centering the top line with David Pastrnak, the offense is looking kind of bleak. It's not like there's a ton of guys who can contribute consistently on the offensive end, especially given some of the guys that they lost in the offseason. Obviously, Jake DeBrusk, Danton Heinen being most notable losses there. And Matt Grzelcyk, losing him on defense kind of hurts. But in return, they brought in Nikita Zadorov, so that's kind of an addition by subtraction. Defensively, I think they still look solid. And I think with the defensive structure, the goaltending will get by. Like I said, with Bussy and Korpisalo, I think they'll be okay for now. But they definitely do need Swayman to come back because if he's going to miss the entire season, then yes, the Bruins maybe could be in jeopardy of missing the playoffs, especially with the Atlantic Division presumably getting a lot tougher this season. But like I said, I still think they're a lock for the playoffs with the talent that they have. There's enough there. They do have a couple kicks at the can left, in my opinion. So, they'll be a playoff team, but we'll dissect the roster. It's like I mentioned, the four group to me looking kind of bleak. I do like the top line of Lindholm, Pastrnak, and Zacha. Obviously, Zacha sort of rejuvenating his career since being acquired from the Devils, and him, having that Czechia connection with Pastrnak, I think definitely helps. He's had some of his best seasons of his career since coming over to Boston, and a lot of guys tend to, when they play for the Bruins, they just have this sort of aura around them where teams or players seem to fit like a glove and just things tend to work out. Like Taylor Hall had some of his best seasons there. Elias Lindholm, I expect more of the same, especially if he's centering an elite talent like David Pastrnak. I think he is going to bounce back and at least contribute somewhat and prove somewhat that he still is a true number one center, at the very least, like a high-end second-line center, right? As for the rest of the forward group, I mean, Brad Marchand is still a really solid player. I mean, his offense maybe takes a dip being a lot older now, but he still proved it in the playoffs that he can contribute offensively. Charlie Coyle was coming off a career season. I guess he's proven that he can, in fact, be a top six forward if he can, in fact, replicate that year, have north of 50 points again. Matthew Poitras is a younger guy who maybe could step in into top six role in the future and definitely has a lot of potential to be a really solid center in the league. But apart from that, it's a lot of just gritty, physical checking forwards, not a ton of offense on that bottom six. Really, apart from the Lightning, maybe even, or Montreal, like this is one of the worst forward groups in the division. But when you have star talent like Pastrnak and even Marchand to a lesser degree, you're still going to score quite a few goals throughout the season. And then you look at the defense. To me, it's still solid. Like I said, you lose Matt Grzelcyk, but you bring in Nikita Zadorov, who's a very solid physical presence. I think he'll complement Charlie McAvoy in that top pair well. And McAvoy probably a Norris caliber defenseman like he has been the past 4 years, basically. Lindholm, Carlo, solid top four. Lohrei could be in for a breakout season. A lot of people are higher on him, taking a step forward, maybe getting a bigger role on that Bruins defense group. Solid defense, really nothing has changed there. Goaltending, again, with the Jeremy Swayman situation looming, maybe that's a distraction. Maybe that hurts their team greatly, but with their strong defensive play, just a team that plays by committee, I think they can get by with Korpisalo and Bussi, at least in the short term, like I mentioned before. So this is still a really solid roster overall. I don't think they're quite the elite team they once were, but do I think they're good enough to make the playoffs? Absolutely. Now, second in the Atlantic Division, I'm going with the Toronto Maple Leafs, 47, 26, and 9. I have them with 103 points, basically about the same as last year, although you can make the case that the team on paper does look a little bit better. I mean, we know this team is going to do well in the regular season. They have for the last 8 seasons now. The core is still intact. They're not really moving on from it, although guys like John Tavares and Mitch Marner both entering the final years of their contracts. This is a very huge season, obviously, for this Maple Leafs core, and kind of it's going to impact where the direction of this team is moving forward. But I definitely think the additions that they made on defense are going to make them a more complete team. I do like the Chris Tanev and Oliver Ekman-Larsson additions on their top four, especially with Chris Tanev being the defensive guy, kind of taking some pressure off of Morgan Rielly, who's more known for his offense, and he could worry more about that and not have to be a defensive presence, even though he's not the greatest defender anyway. Chris Tanev can provide that stability, that stay-at-home play. You know, he's widely considered one of the better defensive defensemen in the league. So I think they struck gold with that signing. I don't like the length of that contract. I think that's going to age poorly with time. But as of right now, where this team kind of is in win-now mode, I think that's a perfect addition for them on that blue line. Yes, losing Tyler Bertuzzi does hurt their top six a bit, but they have guys who are capable of elevating their play. For one, Matthew Knies, I think being on the top line with Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner, he could be in line for a breakout season. I think there's maybe more offense to give than the 30-some points that he gave last year. I think he's definitely at the very least capable of being a 20-goal scorer perennially in this league. And as for the rest of the forwards, I know they have Nylander slated at center. I'm not sure if that's going to be sustained. I think maybe he'll move back to the wing at some point, but I do like the fact that they're trying that out and kind of spreading the wealth offensively with Tavares on the third line and getting the most out of guys like Bobby McMahon, who could probably still get you 15 to 20 goals if he's fully healthy. Nick Robertson, to me, it's got to be a big season for him. This is a prove-it year. He didn't want to stay there, but he obviously re-signed for one more season. This is his opportunity to really elevate his game and take on a bigger role and be that 20-goal scorer that he was projected to be when he was drafted, essentially. But yeah, Max Domi, I think, is solid. One of the more underrated playmakers in the league. I think he's fine in a middle six role. Overall, really well-balanced forward group, and the fourth line is just a shit disturber, more physical, defensive-minded mind with Kampf and Holmberg, and Reeves is kind of just there to be the enforcer and provide a little bit of physicality and toughness to that Leafs team that definitely needs it, let's face it. On defense, like I mentioned, Tanev and Ekman-Larsson, I think, are huge additions to help that top four, help out Morgan Rielly and Jake McCabe. Third pair, Benoit and Liljegren, I think, is fine. Well-rounded team. I think their goaltending is actually going to be better too. Anthony Stolar has been one of the better backups in the league, and I think he is going to thrive as a 1B to Joseph Wall, who I think when fully healthy is a solid goaltender, but his issue has been at the early stages of his career staying healthy. But if both these guys are healthy, I think it's going to be a fantastic tandem. Like I said, there's not a lot to complain about with this Leafs roster. I think it's a good team, very well balanced. I think they're easily going to make the playoffs. The question is, what will they do once they get there? And obviously, by process of elimination, I got the Florida Panthers, the defending Stanley Cup champions, winning the Atlantic Division once again, albeit by a small margin this year, 50-25-7 for 107 points. I know they lost some big pieces in the offseason, but as the team still stands, I still feel like the core is there, obviously. I still feel like they're good enough to win the division. They're still one of the best teams in the NHL, in my opinion, until proven otherwise. I mean, you can't really argue against it, considering that they are the defending Stanley Cup champions. They just won the Stanley Cup this past June. So naturally, I still feel like they're going to be in contention for the Stanley Cup. Kind of like the Rangers in the Metro, this is the one team in the Atlantic that I know for sure is a true Stanley Cup contender because, again, with the issues with Jeremy Swayman, I don't know if Boston is in that contender status. And the Leafs, maybe on paper, it seems they're a contender, but they have yet to really proven that since they haven't really gone deep in the playoffs, under that Leafs core, haven't gone past the second round, only winning one playoff series, in the past 20 years. So they kind of have to prove that they're a playoff or Stanley Cup contender, but the Panthers, obviously, they have proven that. They just won the Cup, and the year before they went to the Stanley Cup Finals. So we know that this team is probably the favorite to go deep into the Atlantic Division. At the very least, I think another Eastern Conference Finals appearance is probably likely for them. Like I said, they took a hit on the blue line, but I honestly didn't mind the additions they made, and they still have a steady top six that can provide their offense. And Sergei Bobrovsky is, quickly becoming, or not becoming, he kind of rejuvenated his career the last couple of seasons, and now he's definitely looks like a top 5 goalie in the NHL. So it's just a really well-balanced roster here in Florida. Got Carter Verhaeghe, who one of the more underrated players in the league, can get you about 35 goals, 70-ish points. Wouldn't surprise me if he hovered around a point per game if he has a career season. Alexander Barkov is probably the best two-way centerman in the league now that Patrice Bergeron is retired, and he's probably consistently going to be up for the Selke Trophy for the next probably decade, most likely. Sam Reinhart coming off a 57-goal season it was. He played absolutely out of his mind this past year. I don't know if he replicates that, but I think at the very least we should expect somewhere between 35 and 40 goals, and maybe he'll get more. Maybe he'll prove that the 57 wasn't a fluke and he can still hover around that, which obviously would help the Panthers greatly if he can replicate the offensive year he just had. Second line of Sam Bennett, Matthew Tkachuk obviously is still a superstar, and Evan Rodriguez. I mean, those guys complement him well. It's just a very gritty, just solid line. And Matthew Tkachuk obviously at the forefront of it, being a guy who can give you 100-plus points on a good season. Last year he had about 80-ish, which I guess was somewhat disappointing, but maybe I think he was coming back from injury early on in the season. So I think now he'll be fully healthy entering the year, and I think he could return to maybe the 100-plus point player he was. So I think the offense as a whole could most likely even improve from last season, if that's even possible. And even their bottom six is just gritty defensive shit disturbers. Fourth line isn't going to give you much. Boqvist, Gillies, and Greer, but Lundell, I think, has potential to be better than a third-line center, and maybe he breaks out, becomes the second-line center at some point during his development. But yeah, the forward group really relies on that top six. And I think the Panthers are obviously fine offensively. They're one of the better offensive teams in the league. On defense, however, we do know that losing Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Brandon Montour are huge losses, but they still have Aaron Ekblad and Gustav Forsling, who as a top pair I think is decent. I think Forsling is one of the more underrated defensemen in the league. He could be poised for a breakout season, probably is by default their number one defenseman now. I think Ekblad is a little bit overrated, but still when he's healthy, which always seems to be a concern for him, he gives you steady top four play, right? But yeah, after that, the defense looks kind of bleak. Kulikov, Mikkola, I think that's more of a third pair, not a second pair. So that right there, they kind of need to add some more defensive depth. But, low risk, high reward additions in Adam Boqvist, who still has the capability of being a solid offensive guy. It seems like he's quarterback in the top unit as it stands. So he could be in for a low-key breakout offensive season, could be a guy that maybe under the radar puts up 40 points or something like that. And Nate Schmidt, I think, in the right situation, can be a serviceable top 4 guy, but his offense has kind of fallen off the last couple of seasons where it looked like he was going to be like a consistent 30 to 40 point defenseman, but hasn't quite hit that. But maybe with the Panthers, he just takes his game to another level, bounces back, rejuvenates his career offensively in some ways, because I still think he has that potential to give a little bit more offense than he has. But overall, obviously the defense is hurting a bit, but I think they can get by with it, especially with how good their offense is, and with Sergei Bobrovsky between the pipes and Spencer Knight backing him up. Still think a young goalie with starter potential at some point. So goaltending tandem to me is solid. Bobrovsky's proven he can still be one of the best goalies in the league, even though his career in Florida got off to a bit of a rocky start, but he's definitely back into full form, into Vezina form. So this team as a whole, just solid overall. No reason to believe why this team couldn't still contend for a Stanley Cup, be one of the better teams in the league. And as a result, that's why I have them winning the Atlantic Division. So with that, that is going to wrap up this video for my Atlantic Division standings predictions for the upcoming NHL 2024-2025 season. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments if you agree or disagree. I know I have some hot takes with this division. It's a very difficult division to predict. I have more faith in some of these other younger teams, and maybe like teams like the Red Wings and Lightning not making the playoffs are a bit of a hot takes, and having the Sens and Sabres over them. I understand, but look, it's a hot take, and I think this division is going to be wild. It's going to be a lot more unpredictable than people think. But obviously, you can sound off in the comments. We can get into debates if you want. I'm all for the discussion, for the engagement in the comments. So let me know your thoughts. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, consider subscribing, and I'll talk to you in the next one.